I'm Jo Masserelli, and I'm the director of the SRV Implementation Project out of Worcester, Massachusetts. I was involved since 1982, 23 years old, when I got introduced to living in a respite house for people with all kinds of impairments. I was teaching high school at the time and needed an inexpensive place to live, and so I heard about this great deal where you could move into this house, they wouldn't charge you anything, and all you had to do was sleep there. And honestly, that's how I got introduced to people with impairments. I found that I really enjoyed being with my roommates, and so I stayed in that field and abandoned high school teaching. You know, it really happened right at the beginning. When I was living in the respite house, I got a chance to go to a PASS workshop. The clinical director of the agency that I worked with suggested that if we wanted to go, we could go. And I figured I needed training since my only training was to teach high school English. So I went, and it just knocked me down, really, that PASS training. It really made me consider some things that I knew in my heart had to be right. But my professional training, although it was brief, told me otherwise. And so here's this Wolfensberger telling me that maybe my gut reactions are what I needed to listen to. And so I followed his work ever since and have been seriously involved with it since about 1989. You know, I think that it was more a case of not so much being changed, but remembering who I was. Much of what I heard from Dr. Wolfensberger resounded with what I had grown up with in terms of my values, my morals, my faith, and that was all that I put aside in college as a college student, just grabbing at life and everything. And I was quite ripe for any idea that came along. And so when I heard Dr. Wolfensberger speak, he really made me think hard about what I had been raised with in terms of an ideology of helping others. And I decided kind of to go back home with him. That was more of what it was like rather than a change. For me, my faith underpins everything. It's the air that I breathe. It's how I make sense of the world, particularly my work with people with impairments. That was hard won. I came to that, or returned to my faith later in life. I'm Roman Catholic. I was raised Catholic. And I have to say that being exposed to Wolfensberger's work first made sense to me on a level of social justice. I didn't really go as deep as faith. It just made sense to me that people with impairments deserved a shot in life and should have the same kinds of opportunities that I have and so on. So I kind of approached it for many years as a fairness issue. But then as I got more and more involved with people with impairments, and as I frankly shared more in their suffering, and I got to see just what happens to people with impairments and their families in the world, and much of it very hard, very harsh even, it made me think on a much deeper level. And so through my work with the least among us, my heart was tugged and my faith was restored. And so I started really approaching it from the perspective of my faith when I got involved with the Catholic Worker, an idea of providing hospitality to people with impairments and people who are devalued by society. And that just made perfect sense to me. It made perfect sense to me with my normalization SRV background. And so it bloomed from there. Originally, in my work, I was interested in rights and independence. Those were the two goals for people with impairments. And so that's what I would pursue. You know, people have the right to make choices about their lives. They have the right to not to live in an institution and so on. Most of my work was in residential services. So there was a strong rights involvement, independence rights involvement. This is the late 1980s. So personal autonomy was really just coming into its own. Self-determination there's a lot of excitement about that concept and that idea. And I was right there with it. I pursued that quite vigorously, really. And then I would do a lot of pass workshops and passing workshops. And that brought me face to face with the big issues in the lives of people with impairments. And then I'd go home and I'd serve the people in my residential services. And although the rights concerns are very important, I would say they're among the top priorities, it occurred to me that they're not always the top priority. That oftentimes, what's called for is just an entering into the relationship with people with impairments, even if their rights are intact, or even if there's not much that we're certain about what we should do. Just being with people with impairments, just trying to understand what it means to be devalued in a kind of a culture that we have. It just asks more of me as a service worker than to defend people in terms of their rights and autonomy. And so that's where the devaluation piece comes in. It's the rights issue is one, or much of what goes on in the field in terms of supporting people toward self-determination, self-advocacy, just seems to be part of the puzzle. And yet people tend to view it as always the most important. And again, I find that not to be so. Sometimes, even more than one's own decisions and one's own choices, sometimes what's called for is somebody to step in and say, we got to try it this way. And one of the reasons we have to try it this way is because I care about you. I know our society, I know our culture, and I think that in this case, this brings my best judgment to bear. We all need that in our lives. We all need somebody to say, just a minute, let's consider another way of being. And what I find is the self-determination ideology prohibits service workers from even feeling they can say that, as if saying that is an imposition, when indeed it can be the companioning thing to do, the prudent thing to do. I think Wolfensberger's best work has been in talking about threats to the lives of devalued people. And a subset of that is how devalued people are threatened in medical settings. And what is it about the modern hospital or modern medical settings that is so potentially damaging to people with impairments? Well, that just grabbed me, those ideas. And so I've been working on those ideas. My dad's a doctor. My brother's a health HMO manager for Blue Cross Blue Shield. He calls himself an analyst. And they battle things out, systemically. At the dinner table, you'd hear this older doctor and this young HMO guy fighting things out. And so I'd listen to that, and always my ear was cocked to think about what happens with people with impairments, never mind the well-insured or the, people who can afford the extra riders in their health insurance. So this idea of medical safeguarding was one that it just made so much sense. It was so relevant for people whose health was impaired. So we started the Medical Safeguarding Project, which is a group of physicians and nurses, mostly nurse practitioners, who accompany the most vulnerable people in our region when they go to the hospital. It operates with the idea that nurses want to talk to nurses, doctors want to talk to doctors, and that a certain kind of advocacy strategy is what's called for in medical settings. I'm not a clinician. What I do with that group is I teach those advocacy strategies as I learned about addressing vulnerability and devaluation in my SRV work. So that's pretty much what we do. We go to the hospital with people. We make sure that the kind of treatment that people receives is excellent care. We use as our standard what the president of Bank America would get from a doctor, and that's the standard we use, and we're always looking to sniff out medical decisions based on devaluation, as opposed to based on relevant understanding of the disease process for people. Well, one example that we had was a woman with pretty advanced gallbladder disease, so advanced that it was affecting her liver and her liver functioning, was denied gallbladder surgery. Now, gallbladder surgery is these days quite run-of-the-mill, and the reason she was denied her surgery was because of mental retardation. That's what the surgeon said. So the advocate accompanied her to the surgeon, and I thought it was kind of an interesting advocacy strategy, because the advocate said to the surgeon, "Don't you do gallbladder surgery under general anesthesia?" And the surgeon said, "Oh, yes, of course." And so then the advocate persisted and said, "Well, how much intellectual involvement do you require then? In other words, what does mental retardation have to do with this run-of-the-mill treatment?" And the surgeon was made to understand that mental retardation is not a reason to deny people the kind of basic health care that they require. So it's just one example of a medical safeguarding strategy. Everything that we do based on the personal, the interpersonal. In other words, we try to influence the hearts and minds of medical providers. We're less concerned about systemic change, and we're more concerned about what's going to benefit a patient in the here and now. Now, we also do training for the purpose of changing minds of groups of people, but all of our advocacy is based upon the individual patient and what they need. Well, what I'd say is that, we teach workshops in personalism. Personalism refers to what one individual can do, assuming personal moral responsibility for the decisions one makes and the kind of caring one offers or withholds. There's all kinds of personal decisions we make. However, SRV is not just based on what an individual can do. Now, those of us who teach SRV teach it with the idea, most of the people who come to our workshops are direct service workers or managers. So we do teach it with a bias toward what one person can do. But there's all kinds of SRV strategies that are available on the level of social organization in terms of one's community or one's larger culture. There's even change strategies based on not just wanting to address the needs of one person, but a whole collectivity of people. It's just that most of the people who come to our workshops aren't in a position to influence those third and fourth tiers. But I think that we do a disservice when we bias our teaching only toward what an individual can do, because SRV is meant to be a bit broader. Of course, there's different trainings. We consider SRV, social role valorization, in a 3-day, 2-evening, or 4-day format. Social role valorization offered in 10 themes. That's the basic training of SRV. And our goal in that training is we have a few goals. One goal is that people better identify with devalued people. That is, that they really step into the shoes of devalued people, see the world a little bit more from their perspective, and understand that a lot of the systemic approaches used to benefit them indeed do not, and can even hurt them. So that's one of the goals, is identification. Another goal is really to expose people who come to our trainings to the ideas that there's all kinds of helping forms, that the goal of what we need to be thinking about, though, is that people have valued place in their society. And the way we do that is through achieving valued social roles. But really another reason for SRV training is to help people to think about what they do, and to not just do for the sake of doing, or do because they're told to do it that way, particularly by service structures, which oftentimes are not helpful. But to really encourage the service worker to use his or her heart and mind and being to bring good in the lives of the people they serve. So many service workers today get the message that everything they do is protocol-based. Everything that they do is, a strategy that they can follow, and in essence that they're interchangeable parts, because if all one does is follow a protocol, anybody can do that. SRV raises the bar. SRV says you as a service worker are important. What's in your mind, what's in your heart about the people that you serve is going to come out in your service. And so think about that. Conform your actions to your beliefs. And so SRV raises those questions. So the passing workshop has other goals. In the passing workshop, we take people into a human service or two, and they visit a residential service, they visit a day service, and they spend time with the people served. And by the way, they're going to visit a service that's not their service. It's a place where they don't work, so that they can be freed up to really think about how social devaluation plays out in service structures in a non-defensive way. So they've visited these places, they've talked to the staff, they've talked to the people served, and then they go back and they do a pretty detailed analysis of what it's like to live here. What's it like to spend the day here? And that can be removing a veil from before the eyes of service workers. That can be very enlightening. It can encourage them really to see the world again from the perspective of the person served and their family, and again question that which they see as normative and that may be quite unhelpful. A lot of what happens in agencies is thoughtless, meaning that people just haven't really analyzed it. And so passing is a tool of analysis to help people think hard about what they do and who they are vis-a-vis the people they serve. I loved Wolfensberger. I just loved that man. And one of the things I loved about him was his sense of fun, a sense of merriment. He really enjoyed being with friends, sharing a drink, sharing a good dinner. He was a pleasure to cook for, because he always enjoyed good food, and honestly, in a way that was just a delight to see him eat. Even he was just, he'd be thrilled really with spending time in just joyful conversation. He would burst into song at the weirdest times, frankly, but he knew so many different songs, and he was very happy to share that. He was especially joyous when people would sing along with him. So those of us who spent a lot of time with him, learned a lot of songs in German, some of which we really don't know what they are, but we sang along with him just to see that beatific look on his face. He enjoyed a drink. Little known fact about Wolf is his favorite drink, besides beer, was anything girly. Anything with an umbrella in it, anything sweet like that. He would call them martinis, but they were really these obscenely creamy, fluffy drinks, and he loved those. At one point, he was a connoisseur of wine. I remember serving him a delicious Chianti, and I saw him dump 4 tablespoons of sugar into his glass because it wasn't sweet enough. It was a $25 bottle of Chianti. I'll never forgive him for that. But he just was a joy to be with. He also, his enjoyment of life was very instructive because he understood suffering. He understood it personally. He understood it for devalued people. And yet, he understood that that wasn't the whole story, that there's more to life than the hardships. Not that the hardships should be ignored. He never once ignored them. He embraced them, but he also embraced the beauty. And I'll always love that about him. At his work, uncovering the threats to the sanctity of the lives of socially devalued people, talking about how good people, even good human service workers, can nonetheless contribute to the deaths of the people that they serve, is probably his most powerful message. And it's his most unpopular message. It's the message for whom he experienced excruciating treatment, really. He was considered a crackpot He was considered just over the edge when he started talking about that. And yet, he started talking about that, by the way, in the late 1970s, as I understand it. And yet now here it is, more than 30 years later, and people don't bat an eye when we talk about the threats to devalued people. It's well understood that the lives of devalued people are cheap in this kind of a society, and that people with impairments are considered still to have lives not worth living in many, many cases. And when Wolf started talking about that in the late 1970s, that was not accepted. And now it's just so obvious to people. What's less obvious, though, is what good people can do about it. And that's what his teaching offers us. And that, I think, is his most important. People who care to listen to it. That's the most important thing he offers us. It's a harsh thing to have to face, you know. It's easier to pick out the enemies that hurt devalued people rather than to think that it could be something that we might be involved with ourselves. In the late 1970s, there was definitely a good guy, bad guy mentality. Good guy was community, bad guy was institution. And here Wolf was pointing fingers even at the good guys. He was even saying that in the community there are threats to the lives of devalued people. And I think many thought of it as a betrayal, really. They thought of him as on the side of doing something constructive and positive. And now the ante is upped. Now we have to consider things that we never wanted to think about before. And he wouldn't relent. He was one to put it in our faces. And for many people, it was just too much reality, I think. And it was very easy to kill the messenger, especially when the messenger was talking about killing. So I met Wolf in 1982. So by then, he was already pretty many years into talking about threats to the lives of devalued people. In 1982, when I was 23 years old, I was the kid. So I'm the second generation, really, of Wolfensberger. Now we are looking at the third and the fourth generation of Wolfensberger. But, you know, I wasn't one of his SU graduate students. I was this young, new human service worker in 1982. I never went to school at SU, so I was another generation, I guess is what I'm saying. So although I didn't have the long history, I could see, and now I have the long history since I've lived so much longer, but I could see how this work in death making was evolving. In 1982, 83, 84, when we would do passing and we would talk about it, we got a lot of pushback. I remember having to find creative ways of teaching the reality that elders were devalued in this society. Never mind their lives were threatened, but that they were devalued. Today, 30 years later, I don't have to make that case. People appreciate that. People understand that. So although I don't have the deep history personally, I can see that even today, when we talk about threats to the lives of people with impairments, some will go along with us, and some will say, rather consciously, not my thing, I'm not going to think about that. It just speaks to who we are as human beings. Wolf always was one to teach about human nature, always. He always talked about human nature. And that's why he was never too disappointed when he was rejected. I'm sure he was on some level inside. But he could be philosophical about it. He could see that. He often would say, a prophet is despised in his own land. And it made sense to him that that would be the case.